For today's video, I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite book subjects, vampires. So hello and welcome back, my fellow fantasy book lovers, or if you're new here, hi and welcome. My name is Kathy, I'm a goth girl from Belgium who loves to read fantasy books. For today's video, I'm going to be talking about my 5 favorite vampire book authors. So I'm going to be listing a few books by both newer and older authors that are vampire themed that have a special place in my heart. Now, of course, I cannot talk about favorite vampire books without somehow including Dracula. For today's video, this is actually on my list. So this is on book number 1 that I would absolutely recommend if you're getting into vampire reading is the book of Dracula by Bram Stoker. Now there's a few other books that I also have, which is called Anno Dracula. I still haven't read it, unfortunately, so maybe someday it will make it to one of my list videos. But for today, Dracula, the classic book by Bram Stoker, is on here. This is the basis of where most of the vampire themed books come from. And of course there's the movies Dracula and then the remake of the movie Dracula, which are also enjoyable. They more or less follow the book, but I feel like the psychological effect of the book is uncomparable. And this is the very old copy, the paperback, that I actually bought secondhand not too long ago because my old copy was actually in French. So I now got it in English. I recently reread it, I think last year or the year before I actually got back into like fantasy reading. If you haven't read the classic Dracula tale yet, I could highly recommend it. It's not a super thick book. It's not the most difficult read. The language is a little bit outdated, but I feel in its time sets it is actually fine. And you can find this book in most libraries, or if you can find it, you can often find it secondhand, very, very cheap. So if you're looking into getting into vampire books, very good staple to just put a good baseline down. Up next, we're getting into my current obsession, one of the authors that blew me away whenever I started reading it again, and it is Kristoff, who has actually written 2 of 3 books in a vampire realm already. The 3rd book is for hopefully next year. It is Empire of the Vampire and Empire of the Damned. This is going to be a trilogy. They are chunks of books, as you can probably tell, and this for me is one of the better takes that I've seen in a very long time on vampires, on the cruelty, on the massacres, on the not romanticization of vampires, but of the cruel, dark creatures that they are. In these books, we follow Gabriel de Leon, who is a silver saint. A silver saint is basically the offspring of when a vampire and a human have a child naturally, so they're not turned vampires, they are born sort of vampires, but they live differently. They don't feed off of people the way that vampires do. They consume blood differently, if they even consume it. They try to avoid it at all costs. They are raised to actually kill the vampires. So in these books, we follow Gabriel de Leon, who is one of those silver saints, and who's actually on a mission to kind of cure the world of the day's death that has happened. So the world when he was young has become all dark and doom and gloom. No crops grow, or barely crops grow. Humans are being hunted and used as cattle for the vampires. It's a very dark setting. I personally absolutely love this series. If you are into sarcastic humor, dark humor, very gory battles with lots of details, but then also like beautiful gothic architecture, there are even love stories, like little romance plot lines in these books, which really surprised me, to be honest. Like, these books are for you. And you can of course wait until the 3rd book is out so you can read the completed trilogy, because Jay has a very good habit on writing masterpieces and ending them on a cliffhanger. So I'm very much looking forward to book 3. I would highly, highly, highly recommend these. Up next, we have another rather new author. This is Carissa Broadbent. She's actually writing as we speak on the Crowns of Nyaxia series. These are gonna be 6 or even 7 books within the same realm, all happening together, and these are 3 of them. This is the completed Nightborn Duet, so we have Serpent and the Wings of Night and Ashes and the Star-Cursed King, and in between is this tiny book which is called 6 Scorched Roses. And for now, the reading order is Serpent and the Wings of Night, then you read 6 Scorched Roses, because the characters from the in-between book, so from the 1.5 book, actually come into book 2, which is Ashes and the Star-Cursed King. This is a more romantasy, vampire-based world or like writing style. There is definitely a heavy accent on the romance in these stories, whereas, for example, in Empire of the Vampire, Empire of the Damned, there wasn't really. The vampires in these books have also been divided into classes. So there's different types of vampires, which was something that I had to get used to. In the first book, it's actually very trial-based. So people compare it to Hunger Games, but it's not really Hunger Games. It's just a trial-based system. The human girl who we follow enters these trials and she wants to complete them, because when you win these trials, you actually get the blessing from the goddess Nyaxia, and she actually can grant you anything that your heart desires. So she wants to be powerful like her father. Her father is one of the vampire kings at the moment that he is in the first book. Then we have book 1.5, which is 6 Scorched Roses, in which we follow Lilith. She's the female main character. She lives in a tiny village that has been cursed and everyone is dying. And she's trying to find a remedy for the illness, for the curse that they have. And for that, she wants to use vampire blood. And luckily, there is a vampire living not too far from her home, and she goes to him to ask for his assistance for vials of blood, which she exchanges for roses. I absolutely loved 6 Scorched Roses. It's a very short and sweet story. It has a lot is going on for how short it is, especially if you compare it to the other 2 books. And I only just recently finished Ashes and the Star-Cursed King. I did enjoy it. There's a few things in the book that I find annoying, which is something that the male main character says to the female main character. There is a lot of build-up in their relationship in book 2. There already was in book 1, but then something happens at the end of book 1. I felt like book 2 was a little bit confusing because they pulled different godly elements into it that I was like, was this really necessary? But I'm very curious to see how it continues. There is another duet being written as we speak, which will follow one of the side characters from these books, but then in her own story. So I'm very excited for that. And of course, there's also Slaying the Vampire Conqueror, which I still need to read. So another author that I would highly keep on your radar, and if you haven't read anything by them yet, is Carissa Broadbent. Up next, we are going to the crustiest, oldest book that I own. I bought this book when I was 15 or 16, hence the gorgeous state of it almost falling apart. The author isn't super known anymore, but this is Poppy Z. Brite, and the book is called Lost Souls, or in French, Âme Perdue. And I remember being very impressed with this book. When I got my hands on this book is whenever I used to live in the middle of nowhere. We didn't have a library with a lot of fantasy books, let alone vampire-based books. So when I found this at a local bookstore, I was super happy. So I read this book when I was still younger and still in the age range of the main character. I actually haven't reread it recently, so maybe I should. But I remember this book having a big impact on me, and I absolutely loved the storytelling. In this book, we follow 15-year-old Nothing, who rebels against her parents and actually runs away from home and gets involved with vampires. And we actually follow the story of her getting involved with multiple vampires. There's a lot of dark stuff happening as well. There is sexual content in these books. This is definitely not a YA book at all, even though I read it when I was a young adult. And the main thing that I remember from this book is the big contrast between the fragile life of the 15-year-old girl and then the immortal vampire surrounding her. This is I'm not gonna say this is a romantic book, but it has a sort of, for me, it has a nostalgic feeling of like the grungy 90s dark goth scene, like the punk rock scene a little bit. That's what this book reminds me of. There are, of course, clubs, etc. in this book as well. So for me, this is a very nostalgic vampire read, also a vampire read that is not glorifying vampires or over-romanticizing vampires. It's like our world and then vampires are in it, and it's maybe not the best thing that they are in it. So yeah, I could highly recommend reading Lost Souls by Poppy Z. Brite. Do read into the synopsis before you actually start reading this book, because it does contain a lot more sexual content than some other books. And then the final book on my list is by S.T. Gibson, and it is called A Dowry of Blood. St. Gibson has quickly become one of the authors that took me by surprise. I had never read anything by them, and now I own 3 books by them, and I absolutely loved this one. It's also a gorgeous edition, let's not lie about it. But in this book, we actually follow the brides of Dracula. The name Dracula is never actually mentioned in these books, but we know, like, the scene setting and everything, we know it is about Dracula's brides. So we follow one of the brides in particular, and this is written in more of a diary style. So it feels very personal. It's also very heavily influenced by her emotions, and this is just... It is darker because you see the dark side of Dracula and how he influences the people around him to do things that he wants them to do and not specifically what they want to do. But it's beautifully written. It's not over-romanticized. There is a lot of romance in the book as well. And there are, of course, multiple people involved with each other. So if you have read the original Dracula, then I would highly recommend picking up this book as well and reading it, because it's a different perspective on what was happening at the time, what happened in the story, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. This is, again, a totally different writing style from all the other books that I've already mentioned, but I feel because of that reason, I love it so much. So these were my 5 author recommendations for vampire books. These are the books that I personally have absolutely loved, that made such a big change in the books that I read, the books that I still read and enjoy. So I feel if you want to pick one of these up, you will be in for a good time. They are all very different, so depending on what you want to read, you could pick one or the other. If you want really the classical tale, then I would go for Dracula. If you have read Dracula and you feel like you want a little bit more insight on it, then I would read A Dowry of Blood. If you are someone who is still nostalgic for the 90s, then I would highly recommend picking up the Poppy Z. Brite Lost Souls book. Also, if you're someone who's like end of their teens, beginning of the 20s, I feel that is the moment that this book will make the biggest impact, because you can still relate to that character who is feeling lost, like an outcast, not really fitting into their family. That is really the feeling that that book encapsulates. And then, of course, you have J. Kristoff with his extremely dark, dry humor. If you want epic battles, if you want like dark high fantasy with vampires, that is J. Kristoff's writing in Empire of the Vampire, Empire of the Damned. And then, of course, with Carissa Broadbent, you have that sprinkle of romantasy that is thrown in. These books are also very combat heavy, there's a lot going on heavy, but they also have that romance that isn't really as present in, for example, J. Kristoff. I really hope that these recommendations help you find your next book with vampires in it. Of course, I will be making more videos on my channel soon, because I am still reading vampire books, so I can constantly update my lists and my recommendations. Should you also want to recommend a book that has vampires in it, feel free to let me know in a comment down below, and also let me know why you enjoyed it so much, because that often helps for me to like push me over that final edge to start reading a book. Of course, give this video a big thumbs up if you liked it, and if you haven't already and you'd like to be, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I make new videos every week and I would love to have you for every single one of them. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you very soon with a new video. Bye!